The talk I'm going to give tonight is about fascism and philofascism, a concept that I have to sort of explain a bit to you. And when I talk about fascism, I mean the different varieties of fascism. Fascism has many faces. One is the German face, Nazism. Other is the Italian face, Mussolini's fascism. That's the original fascism. It's Mussolini who gave the name to his movement, fascism, and that name then is today still used to describe that kind of system. We'll talk in a few minutes about what it really stands for. So this book deals with big business and Hitler. It's about the origins of fascism, the link between fascism and big business. You've all seen a movie, I believe, called about IG Farben, IG Farben, big German.
Yeah, the Council of the Gods.
The Council of the Gods. So there was a link between big business and fascism. And in Germany, big business and Hitler's fascism, Nazism. And there's a link between business and fascist movements, even in countries where fascism didn't come to power. I've just written an article about France in the Second World War. France never got a fascist regime the way that Italy and Germany got a fascist regime, meaning a homegrown regime. France didn't get that. France had to import a fascist regime and did so by, and it's maybe shocking to you, deliberately losing a war. All right? Can you believe that? Deliberately losing a war. It's still a mystery to many people, historians, how France in 1940, with a very mighty army, was actually defeated in a matter of a few weeks by the Germans. And there's lots of theories about it. The Germans were really good, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is, and I can refer to sources about that, is that the French generals, like all generals, if you plan to win a war, there's no guarantee you're going to win it. But if you plan to lose a war, you're guaranteed to lose it. Now, why would any generals want to lose a war? Because they don't like their own government very much. In fact, they despise their own government. It was way too democratic. Way too many lefties, commies, socialists, troublesome people that you want to get rid of. How do you get rid of them? A fascist system. Like Mussolini did in Italy. Like Hitler did in Germany. That's what the French wanted. The French military leaders, French political leaders. Right? So they tried a kind of coup d'etat in France, it didn't work. And then they decided the other option was to import them, to fight a war against the external enemy, as they called it, to defeat the internal enemy. So a defeat against the internal enemy allowed a victory against the internal enemy, the domestic enemy. And that's how indeed what happened. No sooner was France defeated than Marshal Pétain became the Mussolini of France, became the Hitler of France, not quite as bad, became the Franco of France, if you want. So that's how it happened. So there's major links between business, big business, right? There's a big difference. And also the elites, the upper class in general, And that link with fascism in general, and with Hitler's fascism, as in particular, I deal with in this book. It's not too big a book, And so I highly recommend it, is what I'm saying. And to have a sale on tonight, you're lucky. Have a sale on special rate. This book is available at $20. No GST. And the others are too, except for the big one, and this is the big one. This is $25. But that's what deals with the First World War and the origins of the First World War in the 19th century. That's very important because the 19th century, I'll have you know, the 19th century was the mother of the 20th century. Well, that's easy enough. But I mean, the 19th century produced the First World War. And that 19th century is a century of many revolutions, starting early with the French Revolution, 1789. And then Revolution 1830, 1848, 1871, right? Revolutions, always ending up in a war. The French revolutions produced the Napoleonic Wars, right? And then it's ended with a big bang of a big revolution, a big war, in 1418, that ended up producing a big revolution. So there's that dialectic, you know what that means, right? Sort of back and forth, a dialectic between war and revolution that I'm explaining. So to understand the First World War, you got to understand the 19th century. The 19th century was the mother of the First World War. And the First World War is very important because the First World War was the daddy, of that nasty 20th century. And without what happened in the 19th century already. In the First World War, there would have been no fascism, and there would have been, no Second World War. Second World War, in many ways, is now described or considered by many historians to be the second phase of what they call the 30 Years' War of the 20th century. You know what about the 30 Years' War? You know the 30 Years' War in Germany in the 17th century, 1618, 1648? You heard about it? Well, maybe not, but I'll tell you something. That was the first massive, murderous war that lasted for a long time, and it was terrible. It wiped out a third, maybe, of the German population. Right? It was the Civil War, the International War, complex, like all wars, right? And that is, by historians, today historians still think, in the 17th century, the 30 Years' War, that was the worst war, one of the worst wars in history. While the 20th century now has produced, in the view of many historians, another 30 Years' War of its own. Started in 1914 and ended in 1945. It's 31 years, right? After you allow for inflation. So that's my second book. This book is all about it. This is a book about the myths of modern history that deals with the big themes of the 19th and 20th century. So if you're interested in that, ladies and gentlemen, I highly recommend it. So, can I start now? Well, today I want to talk to you, I've been asked to talk, right, about a complex topic called fascism in general. But you guys all know about fascism. Well, you know about fascism. But I want to talk especially about something called philofascism, which is a concept that you may have heard of. I didn't invent it, okay? I didn't come up with this, I occasionally do come up with stuff that I invent. But I mean, this is something that you can find out. But if you Google it, you won't find much. And if you go to that big fount of all wisdom today, Wikipedia, there's nothing under philofascism. And
You're going to write the entry.
I was going to say that. I need you to encourage me to do that. I want to write that damn thing, right? In fact, the notes that damn it, I forgot them, that I was going to use tonight, but I forgot them, that's going to be the beginning of my book on philofascism. Promised. Maybe if next year I come here and say, only $20, or maybe a little more, who knows, right? Philofascism. So what is philofascism, guys? That's important. Philo, I love languages. Do you like languages too? I like languages. We brought up with different languages. It's a privilege. It was hard work. Learning French every day, Latin every day, ancient Greek. What the hell for, right? But we did. But then you get a bit of a talent for dealing with languages, right? And we had Greek, but some of you know Greek too. You know what philosophy means, right? Philos means friend, right? And Sophia is not the name of a lady, it's actually of a girl. It's wisdom, right? If your name is Sophia, it means you're wisdom. Nice name, And my name is not Sophios, or no. Anyways, so philos means friend. But I'm not talking about philosophy, for example, the friends of wisdom, the friends of knowledge, the friends of the sciences, right? People who love to think rationally, the philosophers, right? It's actually philofascism. It's the friends of fascism. And what I'm saying here is this. It's important to know about fascism, but it's also important to know about philofascism. Because the philofascists are not fascists themselves, but they like the fascists. And the fascists could not have done what they ended up doing without the help from their friends, the philofascists. So again, there's what I would refer to as the dialectic, the mutual influencing, so the interaction between the two, And that is very, very important to understand, because the word fascism is used sometimes too loosely, and sometimes people are called, oh, you're a fascist. We got to be very careful, because a lot of people that have been called fascists, they may not have been fascists, they may have been philofascists. And there's a big difference. But before we do that, I want to make sure that you guys know what fascism is. And I know you do. Like, for example, is there anybody here who want to give me a definition of fascism? Where are the experts? Come on. I save the ones in the front. Otherwise, I notice everybody moves to the back for safety. How about in the back over there? What's fascism? Let me facilitate it a bit for you.
You have one right here.
Oh, yeah.
We have another guest speaker describe it as nationalism on steroids.
Nationalism on steroids. Well, that's not a bad way of putting it. It has to do with the emphasis on nationalism, right? That's true. On the importance of the nation, right? And in the context of Germany, that the term, for which unfortunately there's no really good English termination, is what? The Volk, V-O-L-K. Because Volk has this connotation of the country, the nation, the people, the race, okay? The race, very important, right? So one of the attributes, one of the characteristics of a fascist movement, of a fascist ideology, call it a fascist philosophy if you want, right? Fascist thinking, is the emphasis on the importance of the people, right? Our nation, our folk, and not the other guys. And associated with that immediately, the idea that we are the best and they're shit. That idea, that there's a big difference in nations, folks. As in people, we are lucky, congratulations, all of us. We are the good guys. Hello, bravo, and the others are dirt. That's the idea. The Übermensch, as it's called in German, right? The Herrenvolk, the people, the race of lords, versus the Untermensch. When I use these German terms that you may or may not have heard of, that you may be familiar with or not, then you know that the Nazis did not invent this terminology. This terminology comes from guys like Nietzsche, a famous philosopher in the 19th century, and many other great thinkers. And not only Germany, don't get me wrong. I keep harping about Germany, but I mean, fascism is similar elsewhere, okay? The idea of a superiority of our people, our folk, our nation, and the inferiority necessarily of the other guys, right? And not only our people, but our race. Okay, our race. For example, Hitler believed firmly in the superiority of the German people, but also of the Aryan race. What's Aryans? I can tell you something right now. Scientists don't believe in the concept of race. I'll tell you something, race doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as a reality, as Hitler found out when it came to defining people. Because lots of people are mixed blood, A lot of people said, if my great-grandfather's uncle, blah, 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 was Jewish, am I Jewish or not? They had to come up with rules. They couldn't figure it out. It was easy enough to say the white people, the black people, the yellow people, whatever, but there's so many people in between, difficult, right? Today, scientists dismiss the concept of race, but it did exist historically in the minds of people. In the minds of fascists, in the minds of Nazis, it was a very big reality. And that's what we're dealing with here, whether it's the reality or whether the race exists or not. And what fascism then does is this idea that we are the best, we're number one, we're the Herrenvolk, the people of lords. And why is that? Because look at me. Tall, blonde, curly hair, blue eyes, smart, hardworking, versus these other guys, ugly, lazy, stupid, evil, yuck. Every fascist system, whether it was in Italy or in Germany or elsewhere, always believed the superiority of their race. And also, in the historical context, referring to a time in the past, a mythical past, when our nation was great, right? And now we're not so great. Why not? Because they're out there trying to get us. And they've been good at it, and we got to do something to stop them. That's the idea of fascism. Okay. All right, think of Hitler again. So we are the Aryan race. The Germans are the best of the Aryan race, right? But mind you, again, these ideas are not exclusive to Hitler. They're widespread, and they have their roots in the 19th century. I'll get back to that maybe eventually. So and the other guys are trying to get at us. They're jealous, they're envious, and they would just want to basically overthrow the natural or God-given order where we're on top. We the Aryans, we're on top. So who are these bad guys that are after us? Well, now it depends, because fascism really is not very difficult. You got to have an inferior race. But first of all, the superior race, that's us. That's easy enough, right? To Hitler, there was no doubt about it. It was the Germans. But Mussolini said, it's the people of the heirs to the Roman Empire. That's us, right? And then that's the other side. They didn't have that culture that the Roman Empire sort of brought to all of us, right? But there's always somebody else, right? And they're after us, and they're so nasty that they're merciless. They won't stop until they wipe us out. And therefore, my dear friends, there's only one solution. That's for us to get at them before they get to us, to wipe them out. The enemy is merciless, we have to be merciless. You may know a bit about the SS, the German, the Nazi party's kind of elite of elites, They firmly believed that they were the ones who were the concentration camp inmates. They're the ones who basically operated the Holocaust, right? And when they were told, like you're killing women and children like that, how can you do that? It's tough, but we have to. Because if we let these children grow up, they'll kill us. That's the kind of mindset. I'm necessarily making things a little too simplistic here, but I'm trying to make a point, right? And if we'd have a whole course here to talk about these things, we could talk about this much more in detail and discuss it and so on. But I'm giving you the most important points, and I'm trying to make them as clear as I can, but as few words as I can. So that is what fascism is all about then. In fascism, the one word that I would associate with fascism is ambiguity. It's ambiguous. Because in a way, it seems to be for all the people. I'm like fascism, Nazism said, the Germans, we represent the interests of the German people. Meaning it's like, it's for your own good. We're doing all this, we're saying all this, and it may be a tough message, but it's for your good. Meaning we're concerned about the people. And they could speak the language of the people, fascists. Mussolini could speak for hours to people. And we may now laugh at it because, of course, it was the style of the 30s. But a lot of Italians liked the way he said it. Because sometimes he knows how to say it. And same with Hitler. If you listen to Hitler now, you wonder how people could get excited about it. But he had a convincing way of talking. Because he could speak the language of ordinary people. So one thing about fascism is important. It's ambiguous. It seems to be democratic? No, not democratic, but populist. It caters to the people. It pretends to be for the people. It's populist, and the term populism goes around now. We hear the term mentioned with respect to people like Trump, for example, right? And people that somehow claim to represent the interests of the little guys. Yeah, I represent the little guys, against the evil out there, right? And that is really what made it possible for fascism to drum up some support from some people at a time who were under the gun and thought that they needed strong remedies against the evils. And fascism provided easy explanations. There was an enemy out there who was the cause of all troubles. The idea of fascism, like Hitler's fascism and Mussolini, was that if you belong to our Volk and to our race, then congratulations. Bravo, you're a lucky duck. And never mind if you're upper class or lower class. Never mind if you're not so rich. You're still so lucky to be one of us. So don't listen to these guys. What do you call them again? Socialists. Who claim that the primordial conflict in society is between class. No, it's between races, okay? That's an idea, by the way, of the 19th century. They didn't need fascists to invent this. The literature of the 19th century is full of people like that, philosophers, learned people, who claimed that the problems in the world, which they could not deny in the 19th century, the time of industrialization, poverty, strikes, revolutions, the 19th century, the mother of the First World War, that they couldn't deny that there were serious problems. But how to explain them? Well, the explanation of Karl Marx and socialism is it's all class conflict, guys. It's upper classes exploiting the lower classes. That's the problem. The bourgeoisie, or one answer against that, is actually no, it's not, to use the German, it's not Klasse, it's Rasse. It's not class conflict, it's all race conflict, all right? And that is something, that's an idea that actually survived into the First World War and became even stronger during the Russian Revolution, with the idea being promoted that Bolshevism, the Russian revolutionaries, were not proletarians trying to overthrow an upper class. No, they were Jews trying to subvert the God-given natural rule of the people who were on top because of their merits. Okay? Have you heard of the theory of Judeo-Bolshevism? Bolshevism, of course, was the movement led by Lenin, the revolutionaries in Russia, essentially later on to be known as communists, right? Who overthrew the system of the Tsar, right? Which was a medieval system with lots of abuses. And as a result of that, especially since for many years already, in the Russia of the Tsars, a minority that had been particularly persecuted were the Jews because they didn't fit the image of the Russian people, namely being members of the Orthodox Church, right? If you were not a member of the Orthodox Church under the Tsarist system, you were just simply not a full Russian. Just as under Franco, if you weren't a good Catholic, you couldn't be a good Spaniard. Just as before the French Revolution in France of Louis XIV and XV and so on, 16th, if you weren't a Catholic, you couldn't be a good Frenchman, right? Religion was associated with the state. There was no separation of church and state. Well, since Jews had been particularly oppressed, and not the only ones, in the Tsarist Russia, it's logical that in the revolutionary movement against them, in the Bolshevik movement, there were many Jews, right? Of course there was. Trotsky was a Jew, for example. Lenin was not, but some thought he was. It doesn't matter, right? And as a result of that, some people said the explanation fascists would give, that Hitler would give, is that the Russian Revolution, that was not Russian ordinary people rising up wanting to overthrow an unfair medieval-style feudal system whose time had to go. No, it was a Jewish conspiracy. And what they're doing to Russia, that's what they want to do to us. So we have to prevent that. Hitler and the Nazis in Germany called the Soviet Union, the state that emerged from the Russian Revolution, Russland unter Judenherrschaft. Russia ruled by the Jews. Right? That's how he saw it. Right? So again, I want to emphasize that fascists see us, our people, as the people of lords, Herrenvolk is the term, right? And the others as the enemy, as inferior, and the enemy, and so on. But as I mentioned, in a fascist system, the enemy doesn't have to be Jews. It could be Chinese, it could be blacks, it could be whatever. I mean, you can argue again, we could argue for a long time about a lot of these things. But some countries didn't adopt or didn't end up with a fascist system. And one of these countries is the United States. You may have heard of it. It's not far from here, I believe. Right? And but some people argue that one of the reasons why the United States didn't need fascism of any kind, and I'm going to be a little provocative here, is that they already had it. It was already there. It's called white supremacy. Right? White supremacy is actually the same kind of idea, that we are the superior race and the other guys just simply are below us. And you know what? They're dangerous. So we have to have weapons, just in case, don't ask questions, shoot them first, ask questions later. Lynchings, all that stuff, right? I mean, the Jim Crow system, slavery first, Jim Crow system. That is essentially very similar to a fascist system. Again, it wasn't officially adopted by the American government. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying a form of fascism, a latent fascism, existed in a country that was officially not fascist. Having said that, there was an attempt to introduce a fascist system in the United States. Do you know that? In 1934, it's called the business plot. The business plot, again, when leading businessmen plotted to get rid of FDR, Roosevelt, whom they found too easygoing with, for lots of reasons, and felt that they needed somebody. A lot of business people all over the world were dreaming of having somebody in their own country, like Mussolini in Italy, like Hitler in Germany, a man who would bring back what later on would be called law and order, and the rule of the right folks, us, where the others would know their place, and if not, into jail or to the concentration camps or wherever. So that is anyway, that is a feature of fascism. So fascism then has a lot to do with nationalism indeed, as you mentioned that, but see, nationalism is a 19th century idea, but again, many of the ideas of fascism, which is a 20th century movement, post-World War I, the roots of that ism, of the ideology, of the thinking, are in the 19th century. And I mentioned already, for example, the idea that the problems in society are due to not to class problems, but to problems of race. You know, that's the major issue. Are you still with me? Am I boring you? Promise to stay awake? Okay, then I'll go on for a little bit. So, I already mentioned now, having just briefly touched on the topic of fascism, which deserves really to be more discussion, but we don't have that much time. Let's now talk about philofascism. And I already hinted at who the philofascists were. My book, Big Business and Hitler. Philofascists are people who like fascism and who think they can use fascism. They think they can use fascism to achieve their objectives. And they like what fascists do. They may not want to do it themselves, you know, but yeah, they think there's some merit to fascism. Now, not all of them right away, okay? Some leading members of the business community in Germany took a long time before they decided, yeah, fascism is the option. Before they decided on the Hitler option, as some historians call it. And before, in Italy, it took business people like Agnelli, the people of Fiat and Olivetti, not nearly as long to decide that to opt for the fascist solution to their problems. So philofascists are people who think fascism can solve their problems. Or to put it differently, that they can use fascism to solve their problems. Or to put it differently again, you are keen to use fascism as an instrument to do what they want to do. Not a puppet, not that simple. It's much more complex than that. Again, we're going to talk about that. And these people, the people who are the philofascists, are, and here now I'm going to have to admit a bit of color. I don't believe that the fascists were right in the 19th century thinkers like Nietzsche when they believed that the problems in society were due to to race problems. They are due to class problems. They are due to the friction, the tension between an upper class and a lower class, and in between a middle class, okay? And that comes out, that was clearly shown in the French Revolution. Because before the French Revolution, there was no democracy at all. There was only authoritarian systems, authoritarian monarchies. Today we have monarchies too, but they are constitutional monarchies, parliamentary monarchies, But in those days you had an absolute monarchy, right? Louis XIV, right? L'État, c'est moi. The state, that's me. Meaning if I say, take her to prison, I don't have to explain that, take her to prison. If I say, hang this guy, they'll do it. And they said, the king says, we do it. That's not very democratic, is it? No, exactly, but that's how it worked. The king was the boss. By the way, today we still have monarchs, don't we? Are they absolute monarchs like Louis? No. And I've been told that they're now Democrats, right? They love democracy. Hello. Do you think if you were a monarch, what would you prefer? Absolute monarchy or constitutional monarchy? Now mind you, being a constitutional monarch, meaning living in a palace, cutting ribbons, giving little speeches, not a bad job. But Louis XIV would have hated it. And Louis XVI, his great-great-grandson, hated it when that was the offer that came down the pipe during the revolution. He said, screw that, I don't want that. I want to be like my grandpa, Louis XIV, absolute monarch. So they chopped his head off. Right? Now that was a good lesson to be learned. That's why other monarchs later on said, maybe that job of cutting ribbons is not so bad after all, But democracy, let me just tell you this, the idea that they love democracy are monarchs. It's not true. It's not true. Except, of course, for the one monarch after whom this university is named, right? Who was that again? Who? This is called Queen's University, right? But who was the queen after whom this place is named? Come on, hello, yes? Victoria. Right. You know what Queen Victoria said about democracy? She hated democracy. She publicly stated that she despised democracy. In fact, and when one of the great Democrats of her time, of which there were increasing numbers of them, much to her chagrin, and to the chagrin of monarchs everywhere, showed up for a tour of England and was received by the English people with great enthusiasm, she refused to have anything to do with the guy. Who was that guy? who was a great Democrat. He was Italian. Garibaldi. Yeah. You guys look at me like you'd never heard of Garibaldi. If you go to Rome, or Florence, or Venice, or Milan, or Naples, there's always a big square named after Garibaldi. And statues, don't have to ask who that is, Garibaldi. Well, maybe it's Cavour, but okay, you know what I'm saying? The biggest hero. And he was indeed a man of great merit in terms of democracy. And that people in England recognized that. But Queen Victoria didn't want him. She despised democracy. Monarchs, by the way, many monarchs liked fascists. You know that Mussolini was a dictator of Italy in the 1920s and 30s, right? So he came to power in 1922, but Italy before that was a monarchy, right? It was a monarch. So when Mussolini was a dictator, what happened to the monarch? Well, he kept his job. In fact, he was very, very happy. But before that, he hated it. Whenever so often there was elections, and then the damn Italians chose sometimes socialists and communists. Oh my God, you know, Jesus. And then suddenly Mussolini comes in power. The Pope gave his blessing. The monarch gave his blessings. Big business gave their blessings. They liked them. Yeah. In fact, many monarchs, the British monarchy, I told you already, Queen Victoria was not really very democratic at all. She hated democracy. But in the 1930s, good old King George V, right, died, right? And his eldest son became king. You know that? Was anybody there? No. What was his name? I mean, not George, he was George. No, George's name was George. But George's son, what was his name? His name was David. But I mean, he became king. When you become king, you have to choose a regal name. You know that? You can choose your own, but I mean, in my case, Jacques would be just fine. Jacques the First. I like that. But I mean, someone choose a regal name. For example, Henry, you know, or George, you know. Come on, you know. I'll tell you a story. When Princess Diana, remember her? Princess Diana gave birth years ago to a baby boy who was going to be the heir to the throne. His name was William, right? For a long time, they didn't decide on a name. And the papers were speculating what they were going to call him. And it was going to be George, or Henry, or Edward, you know, whatever, right? And I wrote her name. I wrote it to the Royal Mail. And I said, well, I think this was a time when in Quebec there was a lot of separatism. I said they should call him Leroy, you know, because that would Le Roi, right? Le Roi. It's a good name. It's a royal name, right? But did they listen to me? Nah, you know, not at all. Anyways, he became King Edward. He called himself Edward VIII. But Edward VIII, he actually had to abdicate from the throne after a year or so. He loved Hitler. In fact, if you are lucky and you look at YouTube, you may find him. He was the uncle of Queen Elizabeth, teaching Queen Elizabeth the Hitler salute. You know, he loved Hitler. He went to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden. He was crazy about Hitler. And many monarchs were, you know, many monarchs were. The monarchs of many countries loved fascism. Anyways, so back now to who were the philofascists. So the upper class, the very powerful and wealthy people liked fascism. Okay, and when I say that, I mean the upper class, and there's two sections in the upper class. I'm talking about after the First World War, okay? There's two sections in the upper class. The upper class is a fusion, as Schumpeter, who was a famous sociologist, politician, blah, 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 you know, at one point, a long time ago, before you were born, you know, he put a fusion of the old upper class and the new upper class. The old upper class, going back to the Middle Ages, the aristocracy, with, of course, on their side, the churches, you know, the Anglican Church in England, the Catholic Church in France. That was the old upper class, right? And the old upper class, the monarchy, the typical institution of the upper class, monarchs being the primus inter pares of the nobility, right? With these guys, you know, basically being the top of the pyramid in the Middle Ages, the king, the counts, the dukes, you know, the aristocrats, right? And what was the basis of their wealth and power? What was the basis of their wealth and power? See, guys, you gotta ask yourself these questions. I wake up at night sometimes worrying about these things, wondering, and I have to find out, you know. If that happens, don't call me, okay? But I mean, you can Google it or go to Wikipedia. Maybe you'll find the answer. No. So, where was I now?
The basis of the wealth of the...
Yeah, the base. What was the basis of the wealth? You have to ask yourself, what is the basis of the wealth? The basis of the wealth, I'll tell you something, is land ownership. Land ownership. The aristocracy had large holdings of land. Typically, the aristocracy lived in a castle in the countryside. And the whole village and everything around it belonged to moi, not you. But if it belongs to moi, and I live in my chateau, my manor house, and I see all this land, it's beautiful, love it, and there's something missing. Oh, I need all these little people to work the land. I own the land, and you work the land. Isn't that nice? And you'll be so happy that and I live and I look at you and I smile, and I ride my horse, and you doff your cap, right? That's how it works. That's the old land ownership. And the church, by the way, is a big landowner too. That's why the church and the royal governments are together. No separation of church and state. The church, before the French Revolution, owned anywhere between 5 and 10% of all real estate in France. That's plenty of real estate. But the French Revolution took it away. Because the French Revolution was a democratic movement that gave the land to ordinary people. Imagine that. I mean, if you're an aristocrat, you say, holy we can't have that. What do you call that? Democracy? The hell with democracy. We're going to fight tooth and nail against democracy. We don't want that. That's the basic reason. Because if you're going to have democracy, the little people are no longer happy just to basically slave away for the Lord in his castle. They're going to want their own piece of land to work or a better deal, right? And I'm again simplifying things way too much, But, if you're interested, I have written something about feudal France on the eve of the French Revolution, where I describe the system like that, with the role of the peasantry, the nobility, and the church, and all that. So they are the large landowners, right? And they were, there's a wonderful author who died just a few weeks ago, an historian. He was an historian at the United States, at Yale, I think it was. He was actually originally from Luxembourg, Jewish family. He fled just in 1939 from Luxembourg, his family did. Arno Meyer, does the name ring a bell? Arno Meyer. Great, his books knocked my socks off, right? He has written a number of books, Arno Meyer, A-R-N-O-M-A-Y-E-R, about the persistence of the Ancien Regime, how the nobility, in spite of the French Revolution and many losses they suffered at that time, remained very, very influential, especially in countries like Germany, for example, where there was still a Kaiser, an emperor, in 1914. The Habsburg emperors ruled. The Tsar ruled Russia. These are the typical large landowners. Half of Russia was for the Tsar. In Spain, even today, there are noble families of whom it is said, with a bit of exaggeration, that they can walk from Madrid to Seville, 500 kilometers, without ever leaving their own land. And if you travel to Andalusia in the south of Spain, you see wide open spaces, fields, and you see a village where the farmers live, right? And over there is the hacienda. Hacienda was in Spanish hacer, to do. That's where things get done. That's where the work is done. But all the land belongs to the nobleman in the castle. And all the workers that work the land live together in the village and own nothing. And if they're lucky in the morning, they may get picked at Market Square where they report to be hired to work for a few pesetas on the land of the Lord. Well, that's a system that people didn't like. And the idea of overthrowing that system, well, that's a democratic movement. That's doing something for ordinary people. The word democracy, guys, let me just tell you something. A bit more Latin now, Greek. What does democracy mean? Kratos is a Greek word, it means power. And demos is the people. Power for the people. But hold it, it's not that simple. The demos is not just the people. No. The demos is the ordinary people. Ordinary people, the demos. A democracy in ancient Greece, it didn't happen very often, was power for ordinary people, as opposed to the power for the upper class, which were the better people, the aristoi in Greek, aristocracy. Okay, so in Greek there was always this tension. In cities where they could have an aristocratic system, we'd call it today an oligarchy, few in charge, the rule of the few, versus democracy, not the rule of the people, of the lower class, okay, the lower class. A democracy is a system in which people of the lower class, imagine that, can actually have a say in the political power and benefit from the system, okay? And guys, don't believe for a minute that you have a democracy if you can vote every 4 years from some nitwit, I mean, that is not democracy. That's bullshit, all right? But that is the reality now. We are being told that if a democracy, there's a bunch of parties, preferably more than one, because one is no good, but two is okay, And if there's elections, well, most of these elections are pretty meaningless, as you know. I mean, sorry, I don't live in the States. I'm not sorry I'm not in the States, but I'm just saying I'm sorry that I'm going to say something about living in the States. If I would have lived in the States, I wouldn't vote for the presidential elections. It's not worth it. I can already see the two candidates coming down the pipe. I wouldn't waste my time. I wouldn't spend a dollar on gas to go to a polling station. I wouldn't have voted for Obama either. Obama was useless. A facade. I hope I'm not shocking anybody. Is it okay for me to say something like that? Sometimes I feel I have to a bit like that to wake them up. Because if I make it too easy, I'll say, yeah, they've heard it all before, Then they're happy. And I'm out of here, right? But no, I like to shock you a bit. You don't mind, do you? You can handle that, right? Good. All right, so here, democracy has two faces. It's like, it has a political face and a social face. Political face is power, is input from the demos, is what the lower people, the lower class, the ordinary people. And democracy also has a social face, that the system does something for ordinary people. All right? That's where you have democracy. All right? We have a system where it's called a formal democracy. It's formal. It's democracy because we're told it's democracy. I've invented a term for it. It's in my book. Pseudomocracy. It looks like democracy. It smells a bit like democracy. You think it's democracy. Some things look indeed like what we think, but it's not democracy. It's fake. It's not the real thing. That is something you have to ask yourself some questions about. I deal with that in my book on the First World War, where I describe how these things happened in the 19th century. I can tell you another reason why democracy isn't always what it should be. When in the 19th century, because of revolutions, democratization made headway. And some countries had to introduce reforms that made countries more democratic. As in France, for example, the French Revolution, and after 1930. For example, some people say revolutions. But the revolutions were the dynamos, the locomotives of democratization. What about slavery? Well, don't know about it. Yeah. And guess what? And then, so Robespierre, who actually abolished slavery, is ignored. And Napoleon came onto power, who's got statues all over the goddamn place. I was going to use the F word, but I stopped at the right time. He reintroduced slavery. He did. And he has statues all over the goddamn place. Figure that out, right? By the way, when the French revolutionaries abolished slavery in the islands, the Sugar Islands, les Caraïbes in French, les Antilles, some were happy and some were not. While the plantation owners, Frenchmen, were not very happy. But the slaves were very happy. And when Napoleon said, sorry guys, it was all a mistake, would you please go back to being slaves? He said, in French, in French, right? And they started a war, right? And that war was successful. And that gave us the first country run by freed slaves, self-freed slaves. Which country is that? Haiti. Haiti. Now that's interesting history too, isn't it? Haiti today is a very poor country, isn't it? And you know why that is? Because it was despised. These slaves had the nerve to emancipate themselves, well, using the opportunity created by the French Revolution. We can't allow that. Therefore, we have to screw them a little bit. Well, who did that? Well, there was a neighbor called Uncle Sam, whose system was based on slavery, and was very, very, very upset when those goddamn slaves had the nerve to become independent and set up a state of their own. That could not succeed, because that would be a very bad example for our slaves, right? Yeah, very bad example. So the United States proceeded to strangle the revolution in Haiti. You never learned about this? You never learned about this? Well, are you happy I'm telling you that? Or are you sad? No, a bit both. Well, it's a sad story in a way. But you know what I find? I was brought up being fed a lot of nonsense, just like you were. Not in this course, of course. You know, no. But it's true. It's true. I mean, I think back of the bullshit that we were told about Belgian history, for example. I look back now, you know, it's true, right? And all the stuff about how stuff that totally untrue, right? But it was what they call feel-good history. Feel good, because we felt so good, you know. Oh, we felt so good. Oh, we loved that. We were the good guys. Always the good guys. We're always the good guys. The other guys are the bad guys. Kind of fascist thinking, isn't it? Yeah. And what I only learned very gradually, you know, and almost reluctantly, some of these things I'm telling you. And you have to work hard to learn these things. You know, they don't come to you. Wikipedia doesn't tell you that, you know. And I'll tell you something. Sometimes it does hurt to learn these things, that you were lied at. You were given bullshit, you know. But you know what? It's liberating. It's liberating to find out, you know, to realize that it wasn't so, you know, that the reality was very different. And you know what? We better face that reality. Today in the world, there's all kinds of problems. And we in the Western world, we are a kind of fascist thinking people, that we are on top of the world. We are number one, you know, number one, you know. And we are on top. Why are we on top? Because we're so smart, you know, and we worked so hard. We are hard workers, eh? You know. And the others are, why are they so poor over there in this global south? Well, they're not as smart as us, you know. And they're lazy out there, aren't they? It's warm. I understand that, a bit lazy, you know. Yeah. And yeah, they're not very smart, you know, and a bit lazy, and yeah, a bit mean to each other, you know. Thank God we went there a couple of times to teach them some culture, you know. That's it. That's the thinking. In France, Macron is actually sponsoring a new view again of colonization, where France was really, really good to Africa. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. But the thing is, in Africa, I don't believe that. One thing you may have noticed, we think that everybody in the world thinks like the West, right? Like we think, because we think we are the right thinking people, right? We are been on the right side of history. We think if the others don't think like us, that they're wrong, right? Well, let's take the conflict in Ukraine. I'll talk some politics. I won't say anything about it. But we think it's very simple. Russia is the bad guys, and we Ukrainians are the good guys. And we're good guys, we support the good guys. In Africa, South Africans, no, why not? South Africans say, we support the Russians. Oh my God, South Africans, oh my God. And I saw a wonderful interview on TV, but you don't see that here, of the BBC interviewing a South African minister some months ago about what they would do if Putin might visit. They would, of course, have to arrest him and take him to The Hague and all that stuff. And the guy said, we know who our friends are. You know, we suffered under apartheid for years and years and years, and you did nothing about it. You support apartheid and don't believe the nonsense that Mulrooney was. Oh, God, don't believe that shit. You know, that the West supported apartheid all the way through. And the CIA actually allowed the South Africans to arrest Mandela and lock him up for years. And so did our government, right? And who supported them? The Soviet Union did. Big time, all right? For which they're still grateful over there. The Soviet Union is gone, but the Russians are theirs. So they say, they stole that, this guy told the reporter, he said, you know, we know who our friends were. Where were you when there was apartheid, you know? Yeah. And we were supported, we were persecuted by you also. You support apartheid, and the Russians were on our side. So why would we now go after the Russians? You know, we don't believe like you. So the rest of the world doesn't necessarily, you know, think like us. Anyways, are we doing time-wise? How much time do I have anyways?
You have, well, it's 7:30 now. We can take a break at some point, but we have till 9, so you can organize however you like.
Okay, well, I'd like to continue a bit maybe, and then we can take a break.
That's what I think.
It's okay? Okay? It's okay to say, no, it's not okay. You know, but I remember you. I remember those that said, oh, make a note. Okay, so the people with power and wealth, you know, supported fascism, or liked fascism, became philofascists. I'll tell you later on how they did that. And so I mentioned at one point how the upper class, the philofascist upper class, consists of two parts: the old upper class, the aristocrats, the monarchs, the church, the landowning part, you know, and then the new ones, dare I say, the capitalists, the bankers, the industrialists, whose wealth is based on what? What's the belt of capitalism based on? Well, on what? On capital. Well, on capital, right? On capital, that's you got. And then, do you ever hear study economics? You study economics? I learned a bit of economics the hard way, but did you know Samuelson, the basic textbook in economics? That's still around. In my time, that was the big book. No, it's no longer. But the book, I said, screw Samuelson. I read the Anti-Samuelson. It's a great book. It's true. I mean, I learned a lot more from the Anti-Samuelson from the Samuelson. But anyways, economics, it goes like this. Economics is like a box, guys, and things go in and things come out. Okay? So you have to input and output. That's economics, right? Now what goes in, what comes out is determined by what goes in. Okay? So what goes in is three things. Three things goes in. One is resources, raw materials, land, copper, whatever, And another thing goes in is labor. So tip of the hat to labor. And the third thing goes in is capital. And the three combined in the box now, out comes, output for the good of all of us. So if you look at that scheme for a minute, the capitalists are those who have the capital. And labor is the other guys, right? The other guys who provide the labor, obviously, right? But so the capitalists are those who provide the capital in the process. But that raises the question, what is capital, right? What is capital? What is that? But labor is easy. I've seen people do it sometimes, Labor, I love it when others do it. I'm just kidding, But it's true. It's labor is hard work, right? Essentially, the basic labor is human beings communicating, dialoguing with nature to produce things that we need to subsist. Does that make sense? I guess it does. But capital is something that makes labor more productive. Tools, machines, a shovel, and a computer, a truck. Things that make the labor of a farmer, much more efficient than when he has a shovel and stuff than when he has just bare hands. So what you have at capitalists are those who have the tools that make labor more productive. Okay? But where does labor come from? Labor, the tools itself, where does capital come from? Capital is itself the product of labor. Right? A farmer who works with the shovel, whatever, has to be made by somebody. So actually, the input, truly, folks, the input is labor and natural resources. Yeah? And labor produces, one of the outputs is capital, and that goes back in under the label of labor, essentially. Is this too abstract? I'm just saying, to go back now to capitalists. Capitalists are the ones who have the capital. They control the means that make labor more productive. They controlled in the 19th century, in the context of the industrialization process, the factories, the weaving looms, the machinery. They controlled the mines. By the way, that's where the old aristocracy, the landowners, and the capitalists merged. Namely, when large landowners discovered that in their land, your land could be worked by little people to grow food, for example, but sometimes there's stuff in the ground, minerals, like coal. And that means that you as a landowner now, you can, the hell with these little farmers, ship them off to Nova Scotia, to Australia, out of here, right? And instead we bring in laborers to work in the mines, right? That's where it works, right? And what about if I have land and I dig and petroleum comes out? The big petroleum companies, the biggest shareholders in petroleum companies today are, well, for example, the royal family of Holland, Shell, and the British royal family, because they have all that land. You may or may not know that the Prince of Wales owns like half of Cornwall. You know that, don't you? You know that, don't you? That's still the old system, right? You know that. The Prince of Wales used to be Charles. Now he's king, you know that, right? And now his son, Leroy. No. Andrew. He's now the Prince of Wales. He has behind him, he's backed up, or his portfolio is actually managed under the name of the Cornwall Foundation or something like that. And indeed, they own something like half of the land of Cornwall. They collect the rent. That's the medieval system. But of course, on that land, there could be goodies. The Dutch royal family had lots of land in Indonesia, oil, right? Shell, and the British petroleum, So oil comes in. So you have a fusion of the old elites with the new ones because of the minerals that are useful as capital, essentially, found on land of the old landowners. So the new elite is the business elite, is big business, is bankers and industrialists. And it's fair to say, as I point out in my book on the First World War, that before the First World War, in that duo, that tandem of the old elite and the new ones, the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, industrialists, that in the old days until 1914, the first ones were still the leading element. And the bankers and industrialists, the capitalists were sort of a junior partner. But that changed because of the war. After the First World War, the industrialists and bankers are the number one, and the old aristocracy are the number two, a junior partner. And I explain in my book why that was. By the way, the simple reason is this. The First World War was still seen at first as a war like the Napoleonic Wars. Riding into battle on horseback, with swords, 1914. It ends with airplanes, tanks. It's an industrial war. It became the first modern war. And an industrial war has to be planned and can be won only by people when the industrialists play a big role, as opposed to the aristocracy on their high horses. You know what I mean? The aristocracy rode into the war on their high horses, and the winners that come out are the guys in tanks, the industrialists. And that is why the industrialists are the leading element of the elites everywhere in Europe, in the industrialized countries, after the First World War. And they, as well as the old elite, have planned the war. They planned the war, and again, I have to go explain this very briefly. I have to write a big book about it, so this book is all about that, so I'm going to explain to you in the Reader's Digest version, The Great War of 1914-18 was the great anti-democratic and anti-revolutionary project. Let me explain that to you. I told you how the elites hated democracy. And it makes sense. Because if you're the elite, that means you're 5%. Today we sometimes hear saying the rich people of the world are the 1%. And all of us are the 99%. And the 1% own like 75% of all the riches, the wealth, and the 99% own nothing, right? Well, when there's an election based on universal suffrage, what are the chances of the elite winning and forming the government? Zilch. Zilch. So you can well see how monarchs and industrialists in the 19th century already, when somebody started talking about democracy and about universal suffrage, oh my God, that's the end of the world. Can't have that. No way, right? Bang, 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 repression, right? But there was more and more demand. And the lower classes formulated ideas, socialist ideas, and talked about revolution overthrowing the system and demanding reforms within the system. Oh my God, there'll be no end to that. We got to stop that. And the First World War, I explain that in my book, is an attempt to use war to end the democratization process and prevent revolution. All right? By the way, Napoleon had stopped the French Revolution by starting to wage international wars. International conflicts are good for solving domestic conflicts. That's another thing that I deal with in my book, right? So the great irony of the First World War is that it was unleashed, deliberately, by the way. Don't let anybody tell you that it was a fluke, that was an accident, that nobody wanted it and suddenly, whoop, it's war. Bullshit. It was wanted. It was planned. It was definitely planned. It was definitely wanted. It was unleashed. It was provoked. All right? It was planned because it was seen as an opportunity to turn the clock back, to stop the democratization process. Because à la guerre, comme à la guerre, they say in French. In the war, there can be no time for little talks and all that stuff. That's when orders have to be given, and you will obey. We give the orders, you obey. That's the idea of a war, right? And war will stop once and for all that nonsense about a revolution. But the irony of history, because history, as you may know, is full of little ironies, juicy ironies, is that the great counter-revolutionary and anti-democratic project produced the biggest revolution in history in Russia and forced the other countries that weren't affected directly to introduce more democracy to avoid a revolution. You all know that the Russian Revolution broke out in the middle of the First World War, 1917, because of the war. The war basically triggered the revolution. And it broke out in Russia, and it broke out in Germany, and it broke out in Hungary. And you know what? If you read the history books, they never tell you that it came that close to breaking out in Britain, in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Switzerland. But shh, we don't talk about that in the history books because it's unpleasant. We wouldn't want you to start thinking too much about that. It's true, though. There were mutinies in the British Royal Navy in 1917-18. There were major demonstrations. Actually, Lloyd George, at one point, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, considered bombing the working class districts of Glasgow, Liverpool, and Belfast because there were uprisings over there. So what did they do? They faced the same problem that the Tsar had faced, right? And they knew what happened to the Tsar. It's now 1918. So what do? Well, repression, yes, bomb the hell out of them. But your own soldiers are now the revolutionaries, as in Germany. Concessions. Let me give you the example of Belgium. Belgium was involved in the war, and the King of Belgium was the head of the Belgian army. He was behind the front line with the Belgian army. And when the war ends, the Germans start to withdraw. The Belgian army is on the way back to Brussels. And in Brussels, in Germany, there's a revolution going on. And most of the soldiers are revolutionaries, right, at that time. And they fraternize with the civilians in Brussels, who also are very unhappy after 4 years of war, and also want some major changes, which they had been asking for before the war, but the government refused to introduce, such as universal suffrage, okay? And the 8-hour day. Imagine that, an 8-hour day. That people have to work 8 hours a day. That would seem like unthinkable. 12 hours, and only one day off at the end of Sunday, not Saturdays. So people were demanding the 8-hour day, at the 40-hour week if you want, and and universal suffrage and things like that, right? And the King of Belgium is still behind the lines. The war is still not finished. It's almost the 11th of November, the Armistice Day, and they report to him in his headquarters that, "Sir, there's troubles in Brussels." He said, "Oh, what kind of troubles?" He said, "Well, revolution." He said, "My God, what are we going to do about it?" He said, "Well, we can't do anything about it because they're still held by the Germans." And what are the Germans doing about it? Nothing. They're the ones who encourage the revolution. They're all revolutionaries. Oh my God, What can we do? Quick. Proclamation from above. 8-hour day coming up. We promise 8-hour day coming up. Hey there, you potential revolutionaries, the 8-hour day is coming, the 8-hour day. Universal suffrage, promise definitely you're going to get universal suffrage. Introduce reforms that which they despised before the war, we were never going to give in to. Now they offer them. Why? To diffuse the revolutionary situation. Right? And that's what happened. And that's how Belgium got universal suffrage. And something very similar happened in France, in Britain, in Switzerland, the neutral country, and in Holland, a neutral country. Because revolution was brewing everywhere, and everywhere you had to make concessions. So, and the revolution triumphed in Russia. So the war is over. Okay, so is the result a happy one for the elites of Europe? No, not very unhappy. They're very ticked off. Because first of all, the war was going to chase away the specter of revolution. And instead, you got a revolution now. The word has become flesh, It's now incarnated in the Soviet Union. God, bad example, right? Bad example for our own people. And we had to make concessions to democratic concessions, socially, like the 8-hour day, politically, like the universal suffrage, like we would never have given before the war. So we were really screwed. So what did I do now? Say, okay, well, it's too bad. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. No, we got to undo this. We got to undo this. We get into fascism. We got to undo democracy, find a different way of doing it, and we got to destroy that fruit of the revolution, the Soviet Union. And how can we do that? Who's going to do it for us? Well, first they try to do it themselves. The Allies, the British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese sent troops to Russia to basically beat down the revolution, but it didn't work. Why did it not work? Why could the military might of Britain, France, the United States, Japan, even Belgium sent troops to Russia to intervene in the civil war on the side of the counter-revolutionary whites against the Bolshevik, the Bolsheviks, the Reds? Why did it not work? Why did you ever hear about that intervention, by the way? Did you ever hear about that? See, I should come and teach a course here about these things sometime, Well, no, you don't hear about it because it's unpleasant. You know, they don't want you to know about that. You know, just think about happy thoughts, right? No, it didn't work for two reasons. First of all, the dockers in Glasgow and Liverpool refused to load the ships that were on the way to troops to Russia because they sympathized with revolutionaries. That's what I told you. That's why Lloyd George wanted to bomb the working class districts of these cities because they were sympathizing with the Reds in Russia. And not only that, when the soldiers arrived over there, when some did, they fraternized with the Bolsheviks and shot their own officers. Well, you can't fight a war like that, so they had to pull out. But hoping to come back someday. And if we can't do it, maybe somebody else will do it. Who was the great white hope? Who was the great white hope? Well, a few years later, he writes a book. It's called Mein Kampf. His name is Adolf. He has a little mustache. What's his last name? Hitler. He writes a book and he says, my mission on earth, God put me on earth, mission to destroy the Soviet Union. Russia ruled by Jews, remember? That's my mission. Because they're the ones who made a revolution. They're out to get us. And we have to get them before they get us. And by the way, for the industrialists among us, the riches of Russia, the land, the rich farmland of Ukraine, the oil wells of the Caucasus. Hitler, from the beginning, was the great white hope of the elites in Europe that he would destroy the Soviet Union. But not only that, he, of course, had proposed a system that talked a lot about the people, blah, 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 the German, blah, 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 but was very anti-democratic. He actually proposed a regime that was a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime, you know, but at the same time respected the system. You know, he talked revolution. He even called his party a socialist party because that sounded good. People like that, you know, the ordinary people. But people knew he didn't mean it. You know, it was fake. It was a fake. It was a pseudo-socialism, pseudo-revolutionary talk. Right? But that allowed him to get some votes. Okay, to get some votes at elections. And now it's election on universal suffrage, right? And the traditional parties of the elites, you know, and they don't do very well because they don't get votes, right? That's what. So here we go now. Here now, you have guys, fascists come into play now. They now become interesting to the elites as an alternative to what? As an alternative to the traditional way of stopping the democratic nonsense, and that is a military dictatorship. You know, what's wrong with that? You know, if you don't like democracy, probably the military always have generals that are willing to do the job, right? That's South America is a good example for that. Whenever things were getting too democratic in South America, a junta was organized and the military came to power. Pinochet, for example, right? And then it's done with the politics. At one point, the generals took over in Argentina. At one point in Brazil, you know, wherever there's some trouble, oops, sorry, here come the military, you know, and no more nonsense, right? Because if ever the interests of the landowners, because South America is still a land of large landowners, are threatened, their cousins in the military, they take over. You know how it works with the nobility, right? The large landowners in the old days, if you're a large landowner, aristocratic or otherwise, right? You have a system in the family, you know, whereby you're going to give everything to your eldest son, right? And not the younger sons get nothing. Now that seems to be unfair. Well, it may be, but it is because if I now share my land, which I conquered, and I had to kill a few people together, but it's now my land, you know, it's my land. And if I now give it to my three sons, then each one is their own, and then they give it, eventually we'll all be little farmers. You know, that's no damn good, you know. But if I give it to my son, you know, and then especially if he can find a woman to marry who doesn't have brothers, and so she inherits her father's estate, then we can aggrandize our holdings as opposed to minimize them. So good. So that's what we do. That's why I have everything goes to my one son. Primogeniture, it's called, entail. But why then do I, as a nobleman, have more children? Why do I have 2, 3 sons? Why is that? Why don't this is the system? Why? And of course, I hope my daughters to marry them off to a guy like my son, who's going to inherit her father's estate. But I mean, why would I have more than one son? Well, the answer is child mortality, guys. You know, if I only have one son, the chances that he's going to survive to adulthood and succeed me are not so very good. That's why if I'm King Louis XIV, My first son is called Louis, right? And my second one is also called Louis. And the third one, Louis. And the fourth one, Louis. Why is that? If Louis the first dies, the other guy becomes the next Louis, because we want Louis as the name, right? Louis the 14th, 15th, 16th, right? That's why they have hyphenated names. Jean-Louis, Pierre-Louis, you know, Louis-Philippe, you know what I mean? So I have my sons, and they're all Louis. But this is the real Louis, the number one Louis, right? And you are the second Louis. I call you Louis, Pierre-Louis, you know? And the other one is Jean-Louis, you know? And if my first one dies, then Pierre becomes the next Louis, right? And that's what happens. When the king of Spain, France, was executed during the revolution, he was Louis the 16th, you know? His brother comes to power, you know, he was Louis the 18th. The 17th would have been his son, but he never ruled. But I'm just saying, people say, how he comes also Louis? Because his brother. Well, they were all called Louis, you know, that's the way it goes. Like Jacques Louis or something like that, you know, but I missed the Louis because they had no hopes for me. Anyway, so you get the picture, right? So that's how you want more and more land, you know, to aggrandize your holdings. And that's what was I talking about before I got sidetracked here? I was
I was wondering whether you were going to talk about the sons that don't get access to the land and what they're going to do.
Yes, okay, yeah, that's right. So my other son, so then my oldest son does survive, and he becomes the heir, he gets everything. So what do I do with my younger sons? Well, there's two possibilities. This is unemployment relief, you know, for the aristocracy in the old days. Well, first of all, I have a wimpy son. You know what we do? I call the bishop, because I'm a good Catholic, and I say, is there an open job somewhere as abbot in a monastery? Yep. Well, would you take my son? Yep, we'll get him. So you tell your son, hey, got a job for you. Abbot of the monastery of so-and-so. But Papa, I am not very religious. Okay, who gives a shit? You know, because this land, these monasteries, look at Burgundy, vineyards. But what about the chastity business? Oh, yeah, that's for the little guys. You know, we don't have to worry about that. You know, so that's how it works. So he's the wimpy guy. We get him into the church, not an ordinary monk. Okay, abbot, bishop, you know, something like that, right? And what about the third one? The third one is a bit aggressive. You know? Well, that's God. Thank God, there's the army, huh? We get him to the army, and immediately he's an officer, right? Because if you're in the aristocracy, you're an officer. In the British Army in the First World War, if you were from a noble family, you're immediately became an officer. You didn't join the ranks of the ordinary foot soldiers. That's for the ordinary people. You know, you were entitled to be an officer. That's why they had such incompetent nitwits as generals, because you didn't have to know anything. You had to know somebody. Your father had to know somebody. I'm exaggerating only a little bit. Okay, I sometimes do. I must admit that, just a little bit. Okay. So that's how, when in South America today, even, and in some other countries in the global South, the landowners, large landowners, say in Peru or Argentina, you know, suddenly are afraid or worried that there's a movement for more democratic reforms, and God forbid, your land reforms, redistribution of the land. We don't want that, right? But it seems you're going to win the next elections, or they won the election. Well, make a phone call to the army and ask my cousin, my nephew, my brother, my uncle, who's a general. I say, you got to do something about it. That's how Franco got into power in Spain. That's how Pinochet got into power. That's how all of these generals got into power. You know, that's how they could do it. So that is the old-fashioned way. So the old-fashioned way is to basically bring in a military dictatorship. And that's what they did after the First World War. No sooner was the revolution over, concessions had been made, the Soviet Union could not be destroyed, it was still there as a thorn in our side, you know. That's when immediately we went to work to undo the democratic concessions we had made. And for example, let me give an example, Poland. Poland didn't exist before the war. It was occupied partly by Germany, partly by Russia. But then the Allies decided to create an independent Poland. And the leader became a fellow called Pilsudski. If you go to Pilsudski, to Poland today, if it's not the statue in the main square is not John Paul II, which it probably is, there's 500 of them in Poland, then it's Pilsudski. Pilsudski was a popular guy, admittedly, but as soon as he came to power, he became a dictator. You know, he was a military man. He was a dictator of Poland until he died. You know, no democracy. And he ruled to the great satisfaction of the large landowners in Poland, including the church, which was one of the greatest landowners in Poland. Okay? And Horthy, for those of you who know about Hungary. You know Horthy in Hungary? No? Look it up. You know, dictator put in place, right? Franco is an example of that as well. Salazar in Portugal. many dictators. The problem with those guys is that the people who are now have been encouraged by the democratization, are very likely to be pretty ticked off because they recognize these guys as representatives of the old system, which they basically want to overthrow when they made a revolution. So it's risky business. So you prefer to have a dictatorship that seems to be kind of from the people, led by a leader who seems to be from the people, who could speak the language of the people, a populist. Are you with me? A guy who can actually get some votes. You know what I mean? As opposed to a general that we plunk in and everybody hates him. No, these guys, these are the fascists. They have a way of drumming up some support. They can bring in, maybe not a majority, but some people. So these are the guys we're going to use. That is how fascism basically emerges as a major player in many countries. And the first country to have that happen is in Italy. Because in Italy, my dear friends, at the end of the war, in 1918, there was a big revolutionary situation. And it's very understandable if you know that the Italians did not want to go to war. You look at the history of the First World War, and every other country thinks that their soldiers were the bravest, right? And the best, right? They still believe that in Germany, they still believe it in France, they believe it everywhere. And everybody has their heroes. My hero, or the heroes of the First World War, were the Italians. And some of you laugh at that, say the Italians weren't good fighters. Exactly. The Italians went to the trenches, right? And they stood there in the trenches and they said, by the way, Italy started the war only in 1915, right? When the war was already a year on. And everybody knew already how awful it was. And their government cynically declared war against a country it had allied with, and with the country that had been the enemy before the war. So the Italians say, well, what is this? Why do we have to fight these guys? Just obey, do what the man says. Follow orders, off you go. So, the two farmers from Sicily show up in the trenches there, and it's miserable and cold up in the northern parts of Italy. And say, hey, what are we doing here? So, I don't know. And who are these guys? Why are they shooting at us? I don't know. Oh, Jesus. And it's cold here, it's miserable here, and people die here, and it hurt. Let's go home. Yeah, let's go home. And the massive desertation rate was very high. And when the officers tried to stop them, they shot their officers. You know what? I wish many more soldiers had the nerve to tell their officers, if you want to fight, you fight. The farmers of Sicily had nothing against the farmers of Bavaria. To kill each other, murderous war for no reason that they could identify with was a crime. And they were right to say, walk away from it. So when the war was over, the Italians were in a bad mood. And they realized that this war had been forced on them by their government and by their leaders. And that's why there was a revolution in Italy too. A major revolutionary movement, not a revolution like in Russia, but a revolutionary movement. And the elites had to make concessions big time. This was what they called the 2 red years. Il biennio rosso, for those of you who speak Italiano. Yeah, Italiano, I speak Italian. Okay, so the red 2 years. The 48-hour day, the 48-hour week. The universal suffrage, all of that came in. And the elites they had to make a concession, but as soon as the revolutionary storm blew over, let's undo this. And who did it? Mussolini did. They brought Mussolini, and Mussolini said, this is it. The fascists came in, and that was it. No more. Abolished the 40-hour week, abolished universal suffrage, and it was dictatorship. With the blessing of the Pope, of the King, of the big capitalist centurion in Milan, of the large landowners. It's a wonderful movie, and I'm going to stop now for a break. A wonderful movie. You got to see sometime, by an Italian filmmaker called Bertolucci. His name ring a bell? It's called 1900. Okay, promise me you'll watch that movie sometime. Okay, it's a great movie. It's a bit long, a couple of hours, but it's very, very good. Okay, so let's take a break. All right, to be continued. Again, I could talk more, maybe talk about much more about everything here, about the origins of fascism, and here I want to use another term, proto-fascism, because fascism did not fall out of the sky. It emerged in the course of the First World War, but intellectually, ideologically, its roots are in the 19th century, as I already mentioned. But we will not get into that, otherwise we'll be here until tomorrow morning, and I don't think we'd want to do that. So the fascist option became attractive, or became available, you might say, in that context of after the First World War, after the Russian Revolution, when the elite, the upper class, had been forced to make concessions and couldn't wait to undo them, couldn't wait to roll it all back, just as they had hoped to do in 1914, which was actually meant to be a big retour en arrière, as they say in French, a big forward to the past, back to the good old days, So they found. Now, how did they do it? How did they support what happened in the 20s? Well, it took a while. The decision to opt for to go for a fascist solution did not come immediately. It took a while. It had to, because there were reasons. Again, I can't get into that, why it was not so obvious. Let me just give you one reason. Hitler became available, offered his service, so to speak, of him and his movement at the very beginning already, in the 1920, I'd say, But at that stage, he was ignored by the powers that be, by the elite, for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, he was one of many that offered their services. He was not the only fascist, or leader of a movement that we now call fascist, pretending to be acting on behalf of the German people, and willing to use necessary means, violence, getting rid of the enemies and so on, There was more of them. And also, in the context of the end of the First World War, when the revolution was still in the air, trying to trying to create a dictatorship immediately was feared to be likely to provoke a response and basically rekindle the revolutionary fires. So in the early 1920s, when in 1922 Hitler tried to come to power, he didn't get the support he needed because the elites were afraid that could actually restart a revolution, which in 1918 they had only been able to put down with great difficulty. You know about that. You know a bit about the German Revolution of 1918-19? Maybe not. Learn about it. Anyway, so that was one of the reasons. But eventually they would realize that this guy had promise. And from the beginning already, the philofascists became what we sometimes call the enablers of fascists, meaning they basically made it possible for the fascists to rise, meaning to become well-known and popular, get votes, and eventually to come to power. Basically, the philofascists are the enablers of fascist rule. I hope that's fairly clear, isn't it? And how did they do that? Well, they did, first of all, with the means at their disposal. Money, 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 honey, There's a wonderful picture somewhere of the 1920s where it shows Hitler giving a speech to the people, and he goes like this, and there's a big hand of a banker giving him the money. You may have seen that picture. You know which one I mean. Pardon?
I'll send it to them.
Yeah, John Hartfield, I think, yeah. So basically, they financed him. And I should say from the beginning, money to support fascist movements came not only from domestic sources, domestic capitalists, but also from foreign capitalists. For example, Hitler was based in Bavaria, that's in southern Germany, near the border with Austria, and not too far from the border with Switzerland. Well, we know that very early on, Hitler received a lot of money from businesses in Switzerland who liked what he was up to, who liked his... And the reason for that actually is something else for which fascists were useful to capitalists, as I'll tell you in a minute. So they supported him financially. And when Hitler then, with that help, managed to have some success at the elections, it became possible for him perhaps to come to power. They helped him in yet another way. But before I get to that, in that other way, I want to say one more thing about money. There's a great Italian historian, actually there are two great Italian historians that I want to mention, and unfortunately not all their works have been translated into English. Some have not, some in French. One is called Domenico Losurdo, Losurdo. He is one of these historians, like Arno Meyer, whom I mentioned before, that I find made an enormous impact on me. That I must say, when I read his books, I've read just about all of them, his books, and I must say, wow. These are, you know how you can read a book and say, it's interesting, yeah, okay. And you can read a book and it's not interesting. And sometimes you read a book and wow, it knocks your socks off. You suddenly, lights come on, bells start ringing, You ever had that feeling? You would? I do. It's true. Bambino con le Sure is fantastic books. They're fantastic books. And another Italian, so I mentioned his name in case you ever feel like, reading somebody different. And if you read Italian, of course, it would help because his books are not always available in English. Unfortunately, there's a reason why his books aren't available in English. He is not seen to be producing the kind of history that the establishment today likes you to read. You know what I mean? So there's some reasons why he's not yet, some of his books are not yet translated. But the other one is Luciano Canfora, C-A-N-F-O-R-A. Luciano Canfora has written a book on democracy, the idea of democracy, the history of democracy, the concept. He actually is a specialist in ancient history, but he also writes occasionally about contemporary history. And Luciano Canfora, in his book on democracy, made a very good point, I thought. He makes a point that in the 20th century, election victories have to be fabricated. And you have to now stop and think for a minute what fabrication means. Fabricating is not just making, creating, conjuring up. No, it means making in a factory. You know what I mean? It's mass producing, as opposed to manufactured, made by hand, like by manual workers, by artisans. They manufacture. But fabricating is making in a factory. That means a big operation involving machinery, capital, right? Big investments, lots of workers, you know what I mean? A big operation, cranking out lots of stuff, right? Lots goes in, lots goes out. You know what I mean? Economics is simple, isn't it? Yeah. And he says electoral victories must be in the 20th century, the times of modern media, must be fabricated. You can't make a little victory, but a few people can do it. And that's true today. If you want to become a successful politician, you better be rich, or get rich people behind you. Right? Like a guy like Trump. I mean, let's face it. A guy like Trump should never have been considered to be the president of the United States. The United States has a lot of intelligent, capable people. Why doesn't like him become president? Because of money. He has money. Without money, he would never have been anywhere near the White House, right? And you can say the same thing about a lot of other people. And occasionally, the ones that weren't very rich at one point were backed by big money, all right? Because big money saw something in them. Sometimes big money doesn't want to be seen to be in politics. They like to be behind the scenes, so to speak, behind the stage, and let others do the work, so to speak. You can all think of examples of politicians who were from simple background, Recently there was one that died, I believe, somewhere around here, and people were saying he was such a nice guy from a simple family, but such a nice guy. But the politics they come up with happen to be politics that actually favor the big guys. You know what I'm saying? I won't mention names. But anyway, so Canfora makes the point that electoral victories have to be fabricated, mass-produced. That means there has to be big investment made to have the capital that's required. And that means that you need much money to win elections. And it's a fact that in the 1920s, when, as I mentioned earlier, a guy like Hitler was not yet seen to have enough promise from the perspective of the elites, that not enough money was flowing to him, he had no electoral success. But in the late 20s, and especially when the Great Depression hit, and elites in Germany started to get really worried that there might be too much democracy coming down the pipe, that there might even be a demand for revolutionary change, and that fascist option of repressing, labor movements, that would be the best option. That's when the money started to flow to Hitler, and we know that. Money from big corporations, including IG Farben, that you heard about, that you learned about in the movie, right? We can talk about that later on sometime. And big companies in general, and big banks. And big banks also elsewhere in countries where they saw potential of this guy, this seemingly insignificant politician who had long been ignored and now started to look more and more useful. So that is how the elites, the philofascist elites, enabled, the fascists to rise, to be successful, to win electoral victories, and eventually to come to power. But, fascists never won majorities in elections. It's wrong to think, and you may have been told before, that Hitler came to power because the Germans elected him. He won election fair and square. It's not true. He never got a majority. He got a plurality. He got more votes than many other parties, but never a majority. And there could have been coalition governments, which is the rule in Germany at the time and in many other countries, that could have blocked him from coming to power. But so here's another way now in which the philofascists can enable fascists, make it possible for them to actually come to power. And that is by intrigue and by the use of influence and power behind the scenes. And here I should point out something else. When in the 19th century, the elites could not resist the demand for more democracy, a demand that often it was expressed in the form of revolutions, where they had to make concessions, right? And they had to consider, for example, widening the voting franchise, and even contemplate the possibility that they would have to allow universal suffrage. They actually managed to do something which, again, most history books don't talk about, ignore, and that's the following. Elections are for parliaments, okay? And the parliament, there's a government, and it's fair enough that it should be based on universal suffrage. But the government is not all of the state. Do you know what the difference is between a government and a state? The state is the whole machinery of the country, essentially, that runs the country. And the government are the parliamentarians that have a majority in parliament and that can decide on things. But there's, for example, the bureaucracy, the civil service, okay, which are not elected, okay? There's the executive, who in many countries does not depend on a majority in parliament, but is elected separately, like the French president, like the American president. There's a judiciary who are independent, all right? There's a diplomats who are independent, right? There's the army, whose generals are not elected and who tend to come from a certain social economic background, as I mentioned to you. So there's a lot of the state, there's a lot of state power that's actually hiding in loci, in places other than the parliament. Are you with me? And these are beyond the reach of the electorate. So you can vote sometimes all you want for a government, but there's the bureaucracy. And the politicians can vote a law, can make a law, but, if people in the judiciary, the Supreme Court can vote it down. The Supreme Court stacked, for example, with conservative candidates by previous presidents like Trump, for example, right? As they have done recently, throwing out certain laws that were very democratic, and they toss them out. Very undemocratic, isn't it? But and also the military can put a stop to it by means of a coup d'etat. And the judiciary can interpret and misinterpret and blah, blah, blah. And the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, the civil servants, who are supposed to be there to implement whatever policies the parliament decide on. That implementation process, as students in political science will tell you, that is not so obvious. It's not as if the politicians want it and it gets done, because the bureaucrats, the civil servants, can make sure that things are very difficult, or it takes forever, you know what I mean? Can make sure certain things don't happen and other things happen very, very fast, okay? So you might say that the upper classes, in the face of increasing democratization process, focusing on the parliaments, on the elected officials, stashed away all the power in the unelected offices, right? And these are typical places now where, for example, in the 19th century, to be a high-ranking bureaucrat or a diplomat, well, you have to have a university degree, and to be a diplomat, you have to speak Francais, and to be a judge, you have to be a smart man. Oh my God, ordinary yokels did not need to apply. The jobs are reserved for upper class, right? And that was also true, by the way, for university professors. In those days, only very rich people could afford to send their children to university to get a PhD, and basically teach what ought to be taught. So you can see how there was this whole system that actually, where the elite still had power, that actually was more than a counterweight to the power, that the increasing power of ordinary people represented by the parliaments that were elected on the basis of universal suffrage. And that's what happened in Germany, for example. In Germany, under Hitler, Hitler would not have come to power without the support of the judiciary, for example. Hitler himself, in 1922, tried a coup d'etat. It failed. He was thrown in jail. Right? Should have been in jail for 20 years. He was given 1 year. He was given 1 year in a room, like in a kind of hotel room, where he could write his book, receive visitors, send emails. Well, maybe not emails. Anyways, you get the picture, right? Order a good bottle of wine, eat sausage and sauerkraut every day, all he wanted, So he was given a lenient treatment. And the same thing happened with lots of Nazi criminals that committed all kinds of crimes. They went before a judge. The judge had no problem because he liked them. Whereas other socialist communists accused of a small crime in jail for 10 years. So the judiciary, the army is not an example of a state institution that is beyond the reach of voters, all right? And this is what happened now when Hitler could not win the majority needed for him to actually lead a government. That's when, behind the scenes, powerful industrialists and bankers, politicians, high-ranking officials, the executive, President Hindenburg, they got together behind the scenes. And the irony of the whole story, the sarcastic situation, is that Hitler was actually asked to form a government after a major electoral loss, because his biggest victory was in the summer of 1932. Right? And then he didn't win a majority, as he had hoped, and another coalition government was formed. And in November 1932, there was another election. And this time, he lost a lot of seats. He lost a lot of votes and a lot of seats. And he was so depressed, he actually considered committing suicide. And that's the moment, precisely then, that the powers that be decided, he may, if we don't let him in now, put him in power now, that option may be gone. So they called him in and said, by the way, how would you like to be the leader of the government? And that's when he was brought to power. Basically, he was given power. It was the money and the influence of the philofascist upper class that enabled fascists to come to power. And the same thing happened with Mussolini earlier in 1922 already, when Mussolini again did not win an election, but he engineered a charade, the so-called March on Rome. Maybe you've heard about it, maybe not. And that was the same result. Mussolini was asked to form a government, even though he was not the winner of a major election. Which is not to say that he didn't have a following. The money had made electoral victories, or at least successes possible, but never a majority, never really a mandate to form a government. And that's how they got into power. All right, so the philofascist elites were enablers of fascist regimes. All right? They were supporters of fascist movements, and they were enablers of fascist regimes when they come to power, right? And when the fascist regimes are established, the philofascists are the major beneficiaries of a fascist regime. So enablers, beneficiaries, right? Meaning that they got what they wanted. First of all, what did they want? Well, first of all, I told you they didn't like democracy. Well, good. Hitler comes to power, and within no time at all, it's game over for democracy. It becomes a dictatorship, right? I could tell you more about the details, but we don't have time for that. But within a few months, after having been made the head of a government in what was, until that time, still a democratic Germany, the Weimar Republic, suddenly, basically, they do away with all the niceties, and it becomes dictatorship. And all the elites are very happy. Because it's like in the good old days when the emperor was in charge, and there was no democracy to worry about, right? And the first thing he does is he eliminates the class enemy of the upper class. Okay? Who are the class enemy? Well, it's the working class, essentially. The working class and their parties, socialist and communist parties, and their unions, labor unions, immediately eliminated by Hitler. Okay? To the great satisfaction of bankers and businessmen who never liked socialist parties or communist parties or labor unions, So happy. Thank you very much, Mr. Hitler. And indeed, most of you may not know that, but the first concentration camps, which were characteristic of the Nazi regimes, the very first one was set up in Munich on the outskirts of Munich, right after Hitler comes to power, in a place called Dachau. You may have heard the name. A lot of people immediately think that, well, that was for the Jews, but it was not. It was for the communists and the socialists and the opposition. The Jews turn would come. They would end up not only in concentration camps, but in extermination camps, but much later. The first concentration camps were for the opposition, basically for the class enemy of the philofascist enablers of the fascist regimes. You notice I make a distinction here, right? I can say already right now that the philofascists will not make their hands dirty. Okay? The philofascists, upper class, don't run the concentration camps. The fascists do. But the beneficiaries of that are the philofascists. That's why it's important to make that distinction, all right? So far so good. So Hitler comes to power, and right away, the elite have a reason to be satisfied with that, because out goes their class enemy. No more socialists, no more communists, no more trade unions. Wonderful. The business start to look better, because it's the great economic crisis. It's the Great Depression, So business is not good. So we need all the help we can get. And Hitler immediately starts a low-wage policy, okay? So no more trade unions, right? Longer work hours and lower wages. The industrialists are very happy. Basically the capitalists are very, very happy with that. In fact, Germany will become a low-wage country under Hitler, right? Now, economic policy. Hitler comes to power, and it's the Great Depression. And we all know, if you know a bit of history, that Germany was the first country to pull itself out of the Great Depression. Yep, they did. Even getting rid of unemployment. Every German got a job. Low paid, not a good job. Now why is that? How did, and other countries struggled, but it couldn't solve the problem of the Great Depression. But Hitler did. He did it by means of a rearmament program. Okay? Essentially, he went to the German manufacturers of cars, for example, like Mercedes, BMW, making little cars in those days, said, look at guys, how's business? He said, no, very poor. So I look at, it's poor because you're making cars for ordinary Germans. And in those days, BMW was for ordinary Germans, and not anymore. And they have no money because there's no jobs. So forget about that. Produce trucks and engines for tanks and engines for airplanes, and produce them, and we pay the bill. All right. And American branch plants in Germany of American companies like Ford and General Motors, who, by the way, dominated the automobile market in Germany at the time, who had been doing very poor business, suddenly saw their volume of business going up and the profits skyrocketing. Because Ford, from 1933 on, as Hitler comes to power in Germany, is producing trucks and airplanes for the rearmament program of Hitler. And same with General Motors. And Singer, for example. You know what Singer produces? Singer, an American company. You guys are too young to know. Sewing machines, okay? Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R. It's a big name, German company, produces sewing machines, right? And they had a branch plant in Germany, in Wittenberg, Lutherstadt. Well, Luther was from there. And their business was lousy, because people couldn't afford sewing machines. And when Hitler comes to power, their business goes up like this. And they make a lot of money. And why is that? Does Hitler buy sewing machines? No. He says to Singer, look guys, your technology is good for sewing machines, but could you switch that to make machine guns? Yes, happily so. So Singer made a lot of money producing machine guns that would later on mow down countless American and other Allied soldiers. So business suddenly picked up for German companies like Mercedes and Krupp, who made the weapons, the guns, and Thyssen, T-H-Y-S-S-E-N, who made the steel that Krupp used to make the guns, and IG Farben. Okay, what was the specialty of IG Farben? What was the specialty of IG? Why was IG Farben so important for Hitler? And why did IG Farben do so well with Hitler? Why didn't they need each other? Why did they form such a wonderful partnership? Yes?
They made pesticides.
Pardon?
They made great pesticides.
What designs?
Did they not make pesticides?
Well, they made all kinds of pesticides, including Zyklon B, that would be used in the gas chambers. That is well known. But I mean, that is still something in the future at that time. I'm talking about 1933. But Hitler was preparing for war, right? And that's why he had a rearmament program. That's why he told all these companies, you produce weapons for us. And by the way, Germany under Hitler was a capitalist country and remained a capitalist country, okay? So the Germans paid the bills. I'll tell you how. Hitler paid the bills and paid big money to produce weapons. And the weapons were to make war, which the Americans also knew that was to wage war. We'll tell you about that later on. So he makes war. They make these. They make all these weapons for Hitler, and the profits go up. And in fact, they could reinvest. He could bring the profits back to the United States, but they don't. Why not? Because in the United States, it's a depression. There's overproduction. So why invest in your own country? And reinvest in Germany. This is very important. American investments in Germany will mushroom under the Hitler years and during the war. And American big corporations and banks made more money in Germany in the 30s and 40s than it did in the United States itself. Not in the 40s. Okay, now, Mr. Hitler, how are you going to pay your bills? It's fine for you to order from us, German and American capitalists here working in Germany, to order all these trucks and all that stuff, but you got to pay, it's expensive material, right? So yep, I pay. I'll go to the bank. Oh, good, well, the banker's not there. The bankers say, welcome, Mr. Hitler. How much would you borrow? Millions of dollars. In fact, Hitler goes to the German banks to borrow money, and he also goes to banks in the United States to borrow money. And some banks in the United States specialize actually in selling bonds, Nazi bonds, so that Hitler can have money to buy weapons. One of those banks was called the Union Bank of New York. It was run by a fellow called Prescott Bush, okay? And he was the father of George Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush. You've heard of these guys, haven't you? Well, the Bush family, most people think the Bush family made their money in oil and petroleum. No, they made their money in banking for Hitler, in raising money for Hitler. But how did it end up in petroleum? Well, Prescott Bush, a banker in New York, makes so much money, by doing business with Hitler, that he calls his son, says, George, come over here. He says, here's a shitload of money, Take that to Texas and go into the oil business. And produce oil, and I can have you sell it to Hitler. He's paying good money for it. Because indeed, the one big thing Hitler didn't have, Germany didn't have, they had magnificent technology and industries, Krupp, Mercedes, wonderful equipment for making planes and cars and trucks and tanks, But to wage war, these airplanes, these tanks, they need fuel. And if beer could be fuel for tanks and airplanes, Germany would not have had a problem because Germany produces a lot of beer. But unfortunately, you need petroleum, and Germany has no petroleum. So Hitler's big problem was that he could order all that equipment, that rolling material, but where's the petroleum going to come from? Well, Mr. Hitler, that's the big specialty of my friend here, and that is the gentlemen, the Rockefellers of Standard Oil of New Jersey, who are in cahoots with I.G. Farben, as you may know, right? You know that? You know that. You know that, right? Glad. Are you sure? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so now you can see how wonderful it is, right? Ford and General Motors crank out the trucks and the tanks and the airplanes, right? And and Singer makes the machine guns, and Hitler pays, and he buys the fuel, and he goes to the American banks to borrow money. Okay, fantastic. The bankers and the industries make a lot of money. Hold it for a second, Mr. Hitler. You're borrowing money from the banks. I'm a banker. I'm a German banker or American banker. It doesn't matter. Mr. Hitler, you have to pay back. And interest rates are high these days. You know that. Hitler says, we'll pay that. Some people think that the Nazis confiscated everything and forced these poor guys to give the money and produce for nothing. Bullshit. Don't believe it. It's not true. He paid the bills. Eventually with gold from the teeth of his victims in the concentration camps. But he did pay. So, Mr. Hitler, how are you going to pay the bill? If you're a businessman, you can ask the question, right? He says, you know very well what I'm going to do with all that equipment. Oh yes, these tanks and planes. Yeah, I assume it's going to be a war, right? Yeah, that's right, it's going to be a war. Yeah, well, Mr. Hitler, it's no business what we're going to do. War is, we produce that stuff and you buy it, and it's not really our job to ask how you're going to use it, but I'm sure it makes sense that you're going to have a war. Maybe ask who that war is going to be against. Is it going to be maybe France again? Or maybe little Belgium, No, guys. This time there's going to be no bullshit like that. This time we're going to move east and sock it to the goddamn Soviets. That's great. That's great. That's what we wanted to do already after the First World War. We couldn't do it, and he's going to do it. Yeah, these fascists, wonderful. You know? They're going to do the dirty work that we couldn't do. And to do it, he's going to buy weapons from us. We're going to make a lot of money, borrow money from us. And by the way, he says, that war is going to be a war of conquest, a war of looting, a war of rapine, a war that's going to bring in lots of stuff, and that's how we're going to pay back. Okay? So these guys that sell the stuff, these industrialists, they know there's going to be a war. They know it's going to be against the Soviet Union. And they love it, because a war against the Soviet Union, leading to the destruction of the Soviet Union, is what they always wanted. And by the way, to the German industrialists, the idea that we're going to destroy the Soviet Union, means Russia will be yours. All of Russia, all the Soviet Union, the rich agricultural land of the Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the minerals of Siberia, it's all going to be yours. Wow, what a man. Yeah. Don't you love him? Hitler was great for business, wasn't he? That was what it was. The German industry was one of the most advanced industries in the world in the 1930s, right? Powerful businesses, right? Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben, you know, all these guys, right? But Germany had one thing missing, and that was actually minerals. Minerals. The German industry had to import minerals from somewhere else. But the conquest of the Soviet Union, Russia, you know, would have given Germany, as Hitler himself put it, what India had been to Britain. A major big land full of wealth to be exploited at will. It can make them poor to make us rich. And he also compared the conquest of Russia with the conquest of the far west for the Americans. Basically a conquest of a big endless land with wonderful resources, and it's going to be all yours. Now there's going to be some little people in the way, that's just get rid of them. You know, that's the idea. You know, so to Hitler and to German business people, you know, the conquest, the defeat of the Soviet Union would not only mean the defeat of the country representing the revolution, you know, but also the making available to Germany, you know, the unlimited resources of a huge land, you know, that would then resources that would be available, you know, to German industry, including petroleum from the Caucasus. Okay, because as you may know, the Caucasus and Transcaucasia, Azerbaijan, lots of petroleum there, right? And indeed, when Hitler moves into the Soviet Union in 1941, you know, his idea is to conquer the oil wells of the Caucasus, because by that time the stockpiles were running low. But this brings me back to IG Farben that you talked about. Where does IG Farben come in, and why is IG Farben? I say IG Farben. Is it IG Farben? Yeah, well, sometimes it depends how you.
I don't know what people say in English, actually.
Well, I've heard IG. IG is the German way of saying it. Okay, IG Farben. Okay, IG Farben specialty was what kinds of petrochemical stuff, right? You know, including aspirins. Even Bayer was one of the branches of it, but it's now made by somebody else. But the specialty of IG Farben is synthetic fuel. You know what synthetic fuel is? Artificial petroleum. Germany has no petroleum. Hitler is rearming. Hitler wants to have war. He needs petroleum. So he gets petroleum two ways. One is to buy it from American sources, because the United States is the main exporter, if not the only one, of petroleum in the 1930s. And Rockefeller will make plenty of money selling petroleum at high prices to Hitler, who stockpiles as much as he can in anticipation of a war that will start in 1939, right? But it's still not enough, because a war, these tanks are gas guzzlers, right? So this is where IG Farben says, Mr. Hitler, hello, Mr. Hitler, we can help you, you know, we can help you, because we have just invented a way to transform coal, of which we have a lot in Germany, into petroleum, and to transform synthetic fuel, synthetic petroleum. And we have also found a way, you know, to take coal, of which we have a lot in Germany, and transform it into rubber. Rubber. Now, to wage a mobile war, ein motorisierter Krieg, a motorized war, with airplanes running on rubber tires and flying all the way missions to Moscow, right? and tanks running from us to Warsaw and Brussels and Paris and Greece and Yugoslavia, you name it, right? Boom, gas guzzlers, right? You know, the supplies, the stockpiles of American fuel are going down, so you need synthetic fuel. And the countries you conquer, there's a bit of oil there, a bit of oil in Poland, and later on they get some oil in Romania, but never enough to fight that war, right? So I need oil. So IG Farben, says, we'll produce synthetic fuel. Synthetic fuel and synthetic rubber. And that's why Hitler makes a big close partnership with IG Farben. And IG Farben doesn't do it because they're nice guys, they do it to make money. Because they get paid. Hitler pays them. And they're going to get paid with the loot. And you know that IG Farben then, at the end of the war, will help Hitler, even Hitler, when Hitler knows already that he's going to lose the war, right? That he manages to actually keep on fighting for another 2 years, thanks to IG Farben, who set up a big factory. You know about that, don't you? They set up a big factory just outside of Auschwitz, right? The big factory, where the people that are taken to Auschwitz, and the ones that are too old or too young or too sick to work, labor away, they get gassed immediately, and the others are taken to the factory to work, to be worked to death. And when they die, there's others to come. I personally had a neighbor, you know, she was a young woman at that time and taken from Hungary, and she worked in Auschwitz. Her sister died, she survived. And that factory was set up by IG Farben, financed by Deutsche Bank, you know, big bank today, you know, and to produce synthetic rubber to keep the German war machine fighting, going, right? And that's how it actually worked. So IG Farben was a major partner of Hitler. And IG Farben's profits skyrocketed during the war because of that. Especially profits will skyrocket, not only for IG Farben, for all German industries and banks during the war, especially industries, because the low wage rates, as I told you, the low wage policy of Hitler, told you that already. But then when during the war, the German workers don't come back from the Eastern Front, right? Then they have to use imported labor, slave labor, deportees, right? Slave labor. And indeed, the factories in Germany will keep on running thanks to slave labor. And how much do you pay your slave labor, Mr. German capitalist? Zero. Well, there's a cost involved. And the cost involved, we have to pay the SS. The SS, to keep an eye on those buggers. And if any of them don't behave, or God forbid would dare to strike, we put them against the wall and shoot them, or we take them to the concentration camps. That's the SS. That's the most criminal organization of that great criminal organization that the Nazis were, right? And do you know what? You will never believe this. Not so long ago, in a civilized country, people stood up and applauded an SS man, a member of a criminal, despicable organization. It made me sick to my stomach. You know about that? Have you heard about that? Do you know the country it happened? Yeah. A big shame, you know. It's shameful, you know. Anyways, so IG Farben did very well, thank you very much. And by the way, when did it become obvious that Hitler was going to lose the war? Right? When did it become obvious that Hitler was going to lose the war? What was the turning point of the war? Pardon? Well, some people, we're going to commemorate the landings in Normandy in June of this year, the 80th anniversary of the landings in June 1944. Presumably, you'll be told that this was when the liberation of Europe started. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Not true at all. Liberation of Europe had started earlier. In fact, the Allies landed in Normandy to make sure that Europe would be liberated by the Soviets alone. Okay, because the Soviet Union guys that defeated Nazi Germany, okay? That should be the contribution of the Allies was important. Don't get me wrong, right? Don't want to minimize it. But Canada, United States, you know, Britain, it all helped. Nazi Germany was a very powerful country, a military monster. But it was the Soviet Union that defeated them. It was in the Soviet Union that they lost. And you know when they lost? Not even at Stalingrad. The turning point of the war was in December 1941. And it was because when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Germany still had fuel for about 3 or 4 months of warfare because the stockpiles had depleted and IG Farben couldn't produce fast enough. They hadn't even built the installation in Auschwitz yet, right? But not to worry, Hitler and the generals thought, because that war against the Soviet Union will be over in 6 weeks. Because look what we did to the Poles. Look what we did to the Belgians, the French, the Yugoslavs. You know, like, our army is invincible. Our Stukas, we'll just walk right through it. And that Russian army, we just walk right through them. And we started on June the 22nd. It'll be all over by September 1st. And that's when all our millions of soldiers can go back to the factories. We just never did. Millions stayed behind, would never come back. You know that? And they started off, and it's been really, really well at first, right? Oh yeah, really, really well. But somehow that white flag didn't come up on the other side, right? And it's now July, it's now a month later, and officially it's still going well. But Goebbels already writes in his diary that those Soviets are tougher than we thought. And by end of August, when the war is supposed to be almost over, and we'll be supposed to be in the Caucasus, taking all the fuel, the petroleum out of the oil wells over there to keep fighting, we're nowhere near the Caucasus yet, right? And then our factories in the meantime have no labor because all the soldiers are still fighting. Oh my God, we're having a problem, right? And now it's getting cool in Russia. Hell, we never thought it would still be there. The idea that General Winter defeated the Germans is bullshit because they were supposed to have been home by then, right? But it's true, when the winter comes, they're not ready for that, right? But they still keep pushing. They still keep pushing, right? And it's now early December 1941, right? And they're that close, tantalizingly close to Moscow, when the Russians counterattack and throw the Germans back 200 kilometers. And on that day, on the 5th of December 1941, Hitler's generals report to him that he could never win the war anymore. But don't tell anybody, But that's the turning point of the war, right?